Welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 466th meeting since we started in February 2009. We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require a speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view. They can be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give an hour to make a presentation. If anybody interrupts the speaker during his presentation, we remind the interrupter that we listen only one fool at a time. It's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speaker, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to the speaker said for or against. And our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, close the meeting. That's how it works. But before we put in our speaker, we have time for announcements. Anybody have any announcements? Now's the time.
I got one.
Oh, you got an announcement. Here, come on up here.
Yeah. As I've mentioned before, the Dallas Philosophers Forum has moved out of the El Phoenix off of Skillman and Adelia because their rent went up so high that it wasn't profitable for them to function anymore. We found a new place. It's a Boca's restaurant off of Beltline and Central on the southwest corner there. So this next fall, that's where our meetings are going to be, and you'll see it posted on our website within a month or so.
Susan, you got an announcement up here?
Where is it?
It's Central and Beltline.
It takes away. Everybody can see them. This is unbelievable. I just dragged somebody's car here. Yes. Oh, I don't want to drag these up. Okay. Here.
I was just putting them away in South Korea.
It's not so comfortable. She'll make me a color.
My grandsons and I have a pillow business called Democratic Magic Merc. And we have also Frida Kahlo pillows and Bernie dolls and anyways, which one? They're back here on the back table if anybody wants anything.
Yeah, she's gonna make me a different color.
Okay.
Phil, what was there?
Oh, for $30, except for the Frida with the fringe. She's 40. Okay, so here's, they've all seen her. Okay, thank you. Any what?
Drop pillows.
No, the children refuse to make them.
They're real comfortable.
Oh, thank you.
So that's what I want.
Any other announcements? Well, the next 2 weeks, we won't have meetings. July 6th and July 13th, the restaurant's gonna be closed. They're going on vacation. So, I don't know just how long they're gonna be on vacation, 10 days, something like that. We're gonna be, the next 2 weeks, we won't have a meeting. So we'll take the vacation too. And so the next open date for a meeting is July 20th after tonight. And on July 20th, Benny Binion, Dallas gambler and mob boss, Jim Gatewood, a Dallas author, he's going to talk about that. It's a new book he put out. And that should be good. It's on the itinerary here. I'm not going to read all this. On August 3rd, the philosophies of time and their respective perceptions. That's Patrick McElroy. He'll be back to talk about that. And on August 10th, why Trump must be impeached. That's one man's opinion, and he's going to express it. Kenneth Williams, a Democratic activist. That's on your itinerary. On August 17th, reflection on the concepts of race, racial ideas, and racism. That's Jian Lee. She's a PhD in anthropology and a Mandarin teacher. She'll be talking that day. So it's all on your itinerary. But tonight our speaker is John Beesley. He's an English-born author. He's going to talk about greed ruins everything. He's retired after a long time with Xerox. He educated at London's Imperial College and University of Dallas. He will discuss how the American ruling elite has aimed a degree of affluence not seen since the gilded era of the late 19th century. Greed of this scale destroys everything in its path. It's akin to a deadly virus that corrupts the human soul. The downward trajectory is affecting a majority of U.S. households who have lost faith in the fundamental institution of the nation. Unable to influence the course of events, as unhealthy apathy has set in. This apathy well suits the elite and its media apologists who continue to paddle a pablum of myth and nonsense, which would make a charlatan blush. John reviews this problem, which he contends must be seriously challenged to even begin to put this country right again. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Dr. John Beasley.
Did you mention that we're not having meetings?
Yes, I did.
Just the light.
Yeah, I will.
We're sitting back here shining our eyes.
Are you okay now? Can you see?
Let me see.
All right, try to arrange things here.
Tom, can we have the volume up a little bit on the system?
Yeah.
You want to do that, John? Let's just bring the whole system up a little bit.
The big ones, the bottom.
This one?
Yeah, both of them.
Both of them?
Okay, that's a little too much. More than a little too much.
Thank you.
Turn the other one, left one, turn it back. There we go. Try that.
Okay, let's see if we can hear you.
Let's see if that works. All right, I hope you can hear me tonight, folks. We've been having trouble with the microphones. So anyway, so tonight is to talk about greed. And I contend that greed ruins everything. Now, as some of you might know, I wrote a book a while ago called Sabotaging America. Should I publish another edition, I would change it to and say greed has sabotaged America. So anyway, so let's get into it. In terms of socioeconomic indicators, both the US and the United Kingdom are in bad shape. Greed at unprecedented level is the major cause of this. Moreover, greed is destroying the country's future. So this is a very apposite topic to talk about, because I think we're at a crossroads in this country. If I were talking about England, I'd go even further, actually. I think they've gone beyond the point of no return in many respects. Anyway, social indicators such as morbidity, which is illness, and mortality, which is death, especially for middle-aged white Americans, have increased markedly over the last decade as their economic situation has declined. Middle-class Americans have seen the cost of living increase while their buying power has decreased. Since 2009, living costs have risen by 18%, while the federal minimum wage is stuck at $7.25 an hour. This 10-year period is the longest on record without such an increase. Now, pressures from the NRA, the National Restaurateurs Association, has kept tipped employees, that's to say people who work for tips like wait staff and nail technicians, has pegged the minimum wage for wait staff at $2.13 an hour. It's been pegged at this level for 30 years. 30 years. So when I go out to eat, which is quite often these days, because I know that I'm paying their wages, I always tip, as a matter of policy, at least 20% and sometimes more, because I know they need it. Certainly on $2.13 an hour, they really do. So it's not just a tip for service, it's actually paying them a living wage, actually. Anyway, the average living wage for a family of 4 in America
needs about $64,000 a year to cover expenses. And this equates to both husband and wife, or partner, earning about $16 an hour. Well, of course, the poorest Americans have family incomes nowhere near this level, nowhere near it. In fact, 40% of Americans have less than $400 in savings. So if there's a crisis, they have very little to fall back on. 40% of Americans make less than $15 an hour. Less than $15 an hour. 15% of Americans actually earn the minimum wage. And I think because of this social pressures, people have turned to opiate abuse, and roughly today 70,000 a year die from opiate addiction. Now we've had 120 months of job growth, but the real unemployment is still about 8.1%. So that 8.1% equates to 13.5 million people without full-time work. Either they've fallen out of the job market or they're working in the so-called gig economy and so on. And of course, over the last 20 years, we've lost 25 million manufacturing jobs. And of course, they've been replaced by low-wage waitress jobs and other such working in fast food and so on and so forth. So what we've seen in this country is growing inequality. So even members of the billionaire class are growing uneasy about the ever-increasing inequality in America. So Steve Schwarzman, who is worth $13.7 billion, he is CEO of the Blackstone Group, and he was a former advisor to Trump. So he stated that 50% of Americans have been left behind, and that a Marshall Plan is needed as a required remedy. Jamie Dimon, who is head of JP Morgan Chase Bank, wrote, "It is absolutely obvious that a large chunk of Americans have been left behind." Dimon added, "It's essential that we have a strong social safety net and that all countries should strive for continuous improvement in regulations as well as social and welfare conditions." And that's coming from two billionaires. So clearly, these both are worried that the days of winner-take-all capitalism are numbered. And more Americans are finding that gross unfairness is now unacceptable. So just before the 1929 stock market crash, that of course was brought upon by rampant speculation and greed, the top 0.1%, that's to say 1 out of every 1,000 Americans, took just under 12% of the national income. Now, after the Second World War, the so-called Trente Glorieuses of Keynesian economics being applied, that take fell away down to about 3%. So actually the working people began to have a reasonable share of the national income, really because of the pressure of trade unions and so on. And of course this share reached a low point in the mid 1970s. Since then, the greed of the top of the 1%, and especially the 0.1%, has grown to the point now they're taking more than 12%. So this group of people are taking more now than before the 1929 crash. And the reason really for this growth in income of the top 1% and beyond, especially the 0.1%, is that all the productivity gains has gone to this group. So for 25 years after the war, hourly compensation moved in lockstep with the increase in productivity. That's to say, this Trente Glorieuses period. And so, in fact, both went up by about 100%. So people's living standards, Americans, actually doubled in the 25 years after the Second World War. So in the next 20 years, that's to say through 1995, saw productivity increase by a further 50%. And actually hourly compensation, real hourly compensation during that period fell by 17%. So Ronald Reagan's economic war on the American people was well underway. In 2003, productivity had increased by 200% of the post-war level, but hourly compensation was still at the 1973 level, 100% disparity. Currently, productivity is now 250% of what was just after the Second World War, but hourly compensation has only grown by 114%. That's to say there is 136 disparity. So this disparity is continuing to increase. So the term for this, candidly, is gross wage theft by the 1%. I mean, as Jeffrey used to come here and say, I heard him say, that if I had a 30-year-old broken down truck, the 1% would want that as well. So they really want everything.
What don't they want?
They want everything.
Exactly.
And my contention is ruining the country, and I'll prove that later on. So working Americans has been fed the pablum that they are all rugged individuals, and they should abhor any form of collective bargaining. And they bought this, so these duped people have paid a heavy price, because their standard of living actually has fallen. And I think all of us that work amongst or mix with ordinary people can see that, the stresses and strains of this situation. And in fact, you know, this rugged individualism nonsense, you know, was a myth. I mean, most people weren't rugged individuals who went on wagon trains in the West. And even if they went on wagon trains, this was, you know, families went and the whole communities went as a group. It wasn't rugged, it wasn't individualism, it was a community endeavor, in fact. So this whole myth is self-serving by people who are trying to make you believe, don't join groups, don't have collective action, you know, just stand on your own and get ripped off, basically. And what we've also seen is growing child poverty in America. Now, there's a chap called, he's Australian, by the way, folks, Philip Alston. He is United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty. And of course, he actually produced a report on conditions in the United States. And so here are some of the statistics that he's uncovered. 18% of America's children, that's to say some 13.3 million, are living in poverty in 2016 when he did the study, making up almost 1/3 of the total poor. Almost 1 in 5 homeless children, including 1.3 school students, were without a home during the academic year. Infant mortality at 5.8 deaths per 100,000 live births is almost 50% higher than any other advanced nation. The US ranks 25th out of 29 industrial nations in terms of the amount it invests in young children. So Alston warns that policies pursued by the Trump White House are likely to make matters much worse, since he's cut the SNAP program, that is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, by almost 1/3. So much is his compassion and helping hand for the children of our country. So children in America are more than 5 times likely to be poor compared to children in Finland and Denmark. And of course my wife came from Finland, and of course they do have a social responsibility. And of course everybody going to college, it's all paid for in Finland, for example. And of course, this poverty explains why the rates of social mobility between generations is lower than most every other advanced country. I'll let you get to when you are. Anyway, what I'd like to talk about is the triple deception that's been played upon the average working American. The first one really, of course, is this continued and continuing exports of jobs overseas. Not only manufacturing jobs, but white-collar jobs as well. And of course, this has meant wage cuts. So most major corporations, such as AT&T, General Motors, and Wells Fargo, lobbied Trump to cut corporate taxes, which happened from 35% to 21%. And they all claimed, once we get this tax cut, there'll be more jobs, we'll hire more people, and we will create larger amounts of investment, which of course the country needs. And this bill was passed in December 2017. So what have been the results of this? Well, the tax cut was passed, so let's see what AT&T did. So in November 2017, that's to say a month before the bill was passed, AT&T promised to create 7,000 new jobs and spend $1 billion in capital investments. And of course, because of the tax cut, they had an immediate benefit of $21 billion and roughly $3 billion annually thereafter. So what have they done since? Well, they've cut 23,000 jobs and they've cut investment by $1.4 billion. So that's what corporations do once they're given this tax cut. Take General Motors, similar story. So they also lobbied that they do great things for the ordinary worker with this tax cut. So since November 2018, they ceased operations in Michigan, Ohio, Maryland, Ontario, with job losses of 14,000. So what do they do with this money? Basically, they go on a stock buyback scheme, which of course benefits the top officers who have stock options and the like, and so on. Actually, so no money, virtually they didn't raise wages. It all went to the top echelon, top elite. So they had a profit, by the way, of $8 billion, and they paid no federal income tax, which is another great scheme. So Wells Fargo, which is the fourth largest bank, also pledged wage increases and worker training once this tax cut went through. So what happened? Well, they saved $3.7 billion annually from these tax cuts, and they did increase the wages, which was 1/47 of the tax cut they received, about 2 or 3%. So they took 2 or 3% of the tax cut and spent it on the working people. The other thing they did, which is quite common, is the CEO pay was increased by 36%. And again, they spent money buying back shares. That's to say 22.6 billion shares were bought back. And Wells Fargo now plans to eliminate 26,000 jobs over 3 years, many going overseas. So as a Wells Fargo employee said, we need a voice because we are often forgotten about in the pursuit of profits. And that's evident from jobs being sent overseas. So only 4% of Americans saw any wage or bonus increases from these tax cuts. Because as usual, the CEO and the richest saw all these gains, a perverse form of reverse Robin Hood social policy. So the Tax Policy Center has estimated that the Trump tax cuts will increase the national debt by nearly 25 trillion over the next 20 years, and the further tax cuts he'd like to enact would double that to 50 trillion. Okay, so that's the first deception of the American people. Their jobs are being sent overseas, their wages are going down, the real buying power is decreased, and 40% have only $400 to fall back on. So what's the second deception? Like I said, there were three. Well, we are getting a lot of expensive junk from China these days, and it was supposed to be a win-win, and basically it's been a lose-lose. Now, I have an item for your inspection here, which you can pass around. This is a capacitor, and two of these are used in the outside air conditioning unit. One powers the fan.
Has that been discharged?
Yeah.
Okay.
It has. One powers the fan motor, and the other powers the compressor. So you need two. We always need two outside. Now, in the old days, and I've been repairing such things for about 30 odd years now, they almost never failed. Usually these things, nowadays when an AC guy comes to look at an AC, the first thing he'll check is the capacitor, because basically they only last a year. So who is benefiting from this? Well, I looked up, because actually you can buy a dual capacitor that has two capacitors in one. For example, you can buy a 5 microfarad /45 microfarad capacitor. Now, I looked up a US made one, and it costs $24.95. Now, I buy a lot of stuff from Granger. By the way, many of my Xerox compadres joined Granger. They're a sort of a wholesaler of electrical parts. They actually took over Dayton, which is this company. They bought it out. But of course, they source everything from China. You look at the same capacitor, and in the Granger catalog, it's over $40. Now, it's a similar story. This is a contactor. This is a device that when you turn on the AC, 24 volts comes along here, and there's a coil that pulls on it, and it connects up the high voltage of 240 volts. And this is a similar story. These never used to fail. So basically every year or so, I'm replacing these. That one happens to be an old American one, but actually I looked at it. That was made by Square D, and now it's a French company that owns Schneider, that owns another takeover of American business, and they fail, as they say, every 2 years. So the bottom line is that abnormal profits are being made by the retailers, and the U.S. customer is being shortchanged. And this really gives the lie to the great benefits that were supposed to come from free trade. If there's benefits, it's not going to the average American. Okay, the third deception is this, and this is a true story. Actually, there was a lady called Rosalinda Stone. She used to come here, and I've met her recently. But she has an English guy as a boyfriend, and so she had two capacitors replaced. Okay, the outside capacitors. Now the two parts together are going to cost at the most $40, and really I can change them in about 20 minutes. She was charged $600. And so what's happening, these days, and I'll go into why in a minute. In fact, you see, in this so-called free market economy, to work, according to Adam Smith, you must have what's called an arm's length transaction. That's to say, both buyer and the seller have to be equally knowledgeable. But really these days, that is totally, almost never the case. And in the case of AC repairmen, and I see this, by the way, in all sorts of repair these days, you always get ripped off. I mean, you can expect to be ripped off because you really, and of course, we talked about the medical profession last week. I was going to talk about it a lot here, but I won't because we discussed it so much last week. But the whole deal there is totally at non-arm's length. I mean, what should happen, you should actually know the success rate of doctors. You should know when he prescribes a drug, how, is it effective, or is he just prescribing it because he's been given a kickback or so, although the doctor here claimed there was never any kickback, which I find hard to believe. Anyway, as I say, most transactions really are not arm's length, and this gives the lie to the so-called free market. Now, if you'd read my book, Sabotaging America, I go into the economics of that situation quite a bit, actually. About a third of the book is really about economics, and I do recommend you reading it because it is fairly simple reading, but it gives the lie to the Adam Smith and the David Ricardo. David Ricardo really proved mathematically how wonderful the comparative advantage of trade would be. It's a bit mathematical, but he came up with that anyway. So anyway, let's get back to greed. There's a pathology with greed. As I said, it's like a virus that is catching. I mean, and I know almost every country has it, really. And it's got worse. I mean, I can see it since I've come here. Oftentimes you would deal with people who are honest, okay? Now, almost no one seems to be honest. It's sort of a reflection of this pathology. Now, there was a 7-year study done by University of California, Berkeley, and they found as follows. And they actually conducted experiments. This was empirical studies of how people behave as they get more wealthy. Also, how people behave when the scales are weighted in their favor. And of course, it was quite alarming. What they found out that as wealth increases, individuals have less empathy and compassion for others. And with that comes a greater feeling of entitlement and deservedness. Also, there's a greater degree of moralization about the fact that self-interest is good and so on. And of course, there's this greater characterization of the poor. So you divide the poor into two groups. You have the deserving poor, which are very few, and then you have the undeserving poor, which don't deserve to be supported. Whereas I've said many times, the level of unemployment is controlled by a private bank in this country. And no one's ever asked me about that, and I'll explain it. But that's a fact. In the period of the glorious Trente Glorieuses in the UK, unemployment was about 1%, because you had Keynesian economics being applied. Yes, you may think it was true, but that's true. Anyway, so what else goes on? Well, of course, under these circumstances, the American dream has become increasingly unobtainable. And so what are the negative social consequences of this pathology of greed? Well, you have lower social mobility, lower economic growth, lower community cohesion, lower levels of trust, decreased life expectancy, and poorer educational performance. But you have, on the other hand, you have increasing obesity, increasing drug abuse, increasing teenage births, increasing violence, increasing imprisonment, and increasing punishment. So that's what's the social consequences of this pathology of greed. Now, there is a connection, by the way, with CEO bonuses and corporate tax benefits. As we know, in the past few years, we've seen several CEOs taking home $1 billion a year in payment and benefits. $1 billion a year. It blows my mind that anybody could be worth that, and believe me, they are not. Now, so a large proportion of this pay is in fact tax deductible. As a 1991 law was passed, enabled performance-based pay and stock options to be tax deductible. And because of it, corporations are saving about $7 billion a year. So as an example, the CEO, I won't mention his name, of Yummy Brands, that includes Taco Bell and Kentucky Fried Chicken, he did well a year or so back. His performance-based pay was $14.8 million. Now that's shaved $17.1 million off the company tax bill. So you see, there was high rewards for an industry that pays starvation-based wages, actually. So is greed poisoning? And another factor, is greed poisoning and killing Americans? Well, questionable chemicals, which are banned by the EU and many other countries, including China, are finding their way into US food, cosmetics, and plastics. And many of these are known carcinogens. And also now we find nanoparticles, which are extremely small, are now found in fish, especially oysters and mussels. Phthalates, which are plastic softeners, which are known endocrine disruptors, can cause serious health effects. I think every American has some phthalates in their bodies these days. So potassium bromate, we talk about bread, basic commodity. In fact, potassium bromate is a potent oxidizer and helps spread rise. A chemical called ACA, azodicarbonamide, a chemical that forms bubbles and foams, is used to bleach and leaven dough. And both of these are banned, by the way, by the EU. So after chickens, which are factory farmed, are slaughtered, they are washed in chlorine to kill off the bacteria. In fact, studies have shown that this method doesn't kill all bacteria. By the way, this chlorine washing is banned in the EU. So a federal study found that more deaths are attributed to poultry than any other commodity. Now, talking about cosmetics, 1,300 chemicals are used in the cosmetic industry in the USA that are banned in the EU. So poor ladies are putting, foundation on and whatnot. Anyway, but the bottom line is this cost saving, really, and the greed that comes from it, is why many of these questionable chemicals are used, which, as a guy from Imperial College said, only government regulation can change this, which in America is not likely because of the corporate capture of Congress by the major corporations. So greed causes trade, American trade, to decline. And of course, as you may know, the US has not had a positive trade balance in the last 40 years because apparently America isn't making stuff that people want to buy. Now, this was totally untrue after the Second World War. And of course, a lot of it is the fact that so much of manufacturing has been shipped overseas, and of course the motive for that is to increase profits. And so this, the cumulative negative trade balance is over 20 trillion. Now, I heard some moron talk about how wonderful this was because America was giving their dollars and getting all this cheap stuff. Well, it's not cheap because this has to be paid for by selling US assets. So one third of the shares of the top 500 US corporations are in fact foreign owned. Farmland the size of Tennessee is now in foreign hands. That's to say 27 million acres. Texas, I think, has sold off about 3 million acres. And of course, the most egregious thing of all is to get this wonderful free trade going. US corporations have been handing over their technology to the Chinese. And if that's not madness and total stupidity, I don't know what. But then again, many of these CEOs are brain dead, and I've met many of them. Intellect is not their highest attribute. Just greed. And I mean, it was Clinton said there's all this wonderful market there of what, 1.6 billion people. I mean, the Chinese paying coolie wages can't even afford to buy most of the stuff they're making to ship to America. So there isn't a great market there. Anyway, now, of course, in Europe, European EU, you've got about 500 million people. In fact, 200 million people more than live in America. So it should be a great market for America. But you know, when you have food, cosmetics, and plastic-related products that are all banned, obviously you won't be selling in the EU. And when Jack Welch, who was head of GE, right? Went to the EU. The EU politely told him, "Hey, you just can't come here, and we have laws and regulations." So he suddenly realized, oh, I thought I could just do deals and so on. No, you can't. You have to meet what the customer wants. And of course, the latest victim is Boeing. A few weeks ago, there was the Paris Air Show, and that's a great selling arena for aircraft. So what was the result of that? Airbus sold 15 billion, Boeing sold 0. And the reason was, of course, this redesign of the 737. They stretched it to form the 737 MAX. So what they did, they stretched the fuselage, they put in more powerful, more cost-efficient engines, which meant they had to move them forward and up closer to the wing, which meant that the lift is much greater. And so with that, if you turn the power on too much, this would go in a vertical climb because the lift would be so much more. And of course, the aircraft was in danger of stalling. So they put in a software fix, using only one sensor. And of course, we've seen 2 crashes and hundreds of people have lost their lives, and probably that plane, if it ever gets going, won't go until the end of the year. So again, instead of properly redesigning it, so that that would be eliminated, no. And of course, a similar thing happened with the Dreamliner, the 787, where to get increased market, they passed through the design and some of the manufacturing to various countries around the world. Well, as one who has put products out, you'd never do that in a million years. Because design teams, as we did, you have the engineers, you have the manufacturing engineers, you have the field service engineers and the sales people, all working on one team together. So when you parcel it out, it delays things down, you inevitably get problems, and that's what happened. So because of all of this, the 787 was 3 years late. And hot on his heels was the EU Airbus, which is, a hot competitor. So because of this greed and stupidity, mostly by marketeers and bean counters, you get these crazy things going on that, The other thing that goes on is when we put a product out in Xerox, every part had a reliability factor. Every single part, because it was all American made. So when that thing went out the door, we tested it. So a little story about that. When we came out with our 620 computer, and IBM came out with their computer, we put, I think it was about 20 of each in Richardson schools. The building was struck by lightning. All the IBM machines failed because they didn't do proper tests as we did. And so these days, with these junky Chinese parts coming in, goodness, I wouldn't like to put my name and be responsible as an engineering manager for that pile of junk. Another thing that happened, my wife wanted to have a digital radio so she could listen to overseas broadcasts from Europe. The guarantee was 90 days. That's how long it lasted. And it wasn't cheap. It was not cheap. It was cost several $100. So you see, the customer here is being fleeced uphill and down dale by this greed culture. And of course, greed, as I said before, reduces the gross national product. Because 70% of the gross national product, the GDP, is created by consumer spending. Now, of course, when you, as corporations do, engage in wage and benefit suppression, what you're doing, you're suppressing demand. So what have we seen over the last 40 years? We've seen about a 30% suppression because of lower wages and lower benefits. We've seen a 30% suppression of demand, which means that, you know, the GDP should be about 30% more, really, if wages and benefits are kept up with productivity. And so basically, where has all this, the benefits of productivity gone? Well, of course, it's gone to the 1% and especially the 0.1%. So where has that money gone? Well, it hasn't gone into wages, it hasn't gone into research and R&D, or education, or healthcare, or anything else. It's basically gone into productive assets. It's gone into housing, it's gone into yachts, it's gone into the stock market. None of that, basically, is productive. So that's why we see house prices going through the roof. And also with that, because you've seen less and less affordable housing being built. So we have a housing crisis. So the other thing, of course, what you see corporations doing is offloading just about as much as they can do to the customer. I mean, as I go to Home Depot a lot, I spend all my time wandering around the place trying to find stuff. Okay, and of course, if you go into a different one, the layout is also different. And to top it all, when you go to checkout, you do your checkout. So they were running skeleton staff, you know. So in the old days, you know, I remember shopping for the green groceries for my mother. You go along and someone would wait for you. They would bring you the potatoes and stuff, and you'd pay them, and that was it. But no, it's all. And of course, I won't mention polluting the place and so on and so forth. So, but we finally come to Wall Street greed. And now, Wall Street greed just, as the financial community in general, tops the lot. And I think, I would say, I won't talk about the City of London, but they're probably the worst of them all, actually. City of London is the financial district. It's a square mile. It's the financial district in London. So, speculative greed is associated with the financial system, and especially, and it was responsible for the majority of recessions of the past 90 years. So, of course, the Great Recession of 2008 and 9 was caused by the bankers, but the bankers made sure that they received their bonuses from the huge speculative profits, which magically disappeared, you know, in the crash, but they got their bonuses. Now, the most egregious example of this was a company called AIG, an insurance companies, which provided insurance against derivative losses. Now, derivatives are nothing more than gambling that some commodity or mortgage will go up or down, okay? And so you can hedge against that by buying a derivative. The only problem was that there are huge profits to be made selling them, but AIG had no funds to back them up. So they weren't actually covered by normal insurance regulation. Like an insurance company must have the assets in the bank to cover up, okay? Because losses will happen. So in this case, gargantuan losses were made, and there was no funds. So anyway, let's talk about Joe Cassano. Now, Jumping Joe Cassano operated out of London because, courtesy of Margaret Thatcher, there were no regulations in the finance industry, which is why all the investment banks in London were taken over by foreign companies, because they could go to London and do just what they wanted to do. And Joe was an example of this. So, he was over in London 7 years selling derivatives insurance, and he made himself, in that period, $280 million. Took home $280 million. And of course, in 2008 came the crash. AIG lost about $12 million. But Jolting Joe here was allowed to keep his annual bonus of $34 million and was kept on for many months at $1 million a month. Great reward for crashing the whole company. But because, as you know, with Paulson, who came from Goldman Sachs, wanted to make sure that AIG was bailed out, because in fact Goldman Sachs had a lot of derivatives, and so they were made whole. And of course, what happened? Almost nobody was punished. I mean, I believe it was sort of unlegalized thievery that went on. And of course, as always, it was the poorest that took the blame or the punishment of it. Now, and of course, what happened was there was even greater consolidation, because the bigger banks, the big four, bought up smaller banks. And of course, as we know, the Federal Reserve was lading out billions and billions to these banks that failed. Now, I'd love to run a business myself where if I fail, I get rewarded. I take home $1 million a month. I'd love to find a scheme like that, I must say. I mean, tell me where such a place exists.
You're a politician.
Well, well, listen. The truth of the matter is, the Congress, which is as crooked as is funded from the corporations or Wall Street. Take your pick. Both parties are the same, really. For all their fine words, they're basically the same. And I won't go back to the major cause. You can ask me what the root cause of this whole problem is, and I'll be pleased to tell you. You can ask me a question if you want, and I invite you. So other countries actually, with this debacle going on, because it wasn't just American banks. I mean, French banks, BNP Paribas went broke, by the way. Deutsche Bank, which of course is laundering money from the Russians to fund Trump and his gang, also went into demise as well and had to be bailed out. So it was all around the world. This rippled through, because because in fact regulations have been decreasing all around. It was bound to crash, actually. And what we've seen, because of speculation, we saw the dot-com crash in the 90s, which was easily predictable. We saw the house bubble crash in the 2007 and 8 and so on, and we're headed for another debt bubble crash, as Ravi Batra said the other week when he was here. It's all caused by, no regulations, let rips, folk. And it's lovely while everything's going up. But anyway, so basically what happens in this wonderful country where it's unthinkable to nationalize banks is that Wall Street gets bailed out, but Main Street is left to fend for itself. So the poorest went to the wall, homes were lost, lives ruined, suicides multiplied. No matter, the banks were recapitalized and were soon opposing the Dodd-Frank legislation that was intended to curb their wrongdoing. And of course, much of it has not been implemented, actually. And of course, I know that JP Morgan, well, Citibank actually, which was one of the worst, actually, in terms of its losses, wanted to make sure it could grab hold of just our regular deposits, because these days, there's wholesale gambling on the commodity markets and fixing, and it goes on apace, really. And so, really, I mean, for example, the foreign exchange market, which I look at a lot, zooms up and down 20% a year, because of all this speculation. Because actually, the stock market is totally unregulated. And of course, as we know, a couple of people got fined for trying to fix the stock market the other year. So anyway, so of course, for this high level felony engaged by the bankers, almost nobody went to jail. Whereas if you have a young boy going into a 7-Eleven and stealing a bun, he'll be marked for life. Such is the morality of the American judicial system. So that concludes my talk for tonight. So I invite any questions.
Thank you very much. The question I ask myself often, and in capitalism, does all the wealth inherently end up with a few people? Is that an inherent quality of capitalism? But really, I'm asking in two ways. Is you can have a capitalism with a fixed money supply, or you can have a central bank system where the money supply can grow and grow and grow. So I really think I'm asking for both systems.
Okay. Well, the answer is, of course, that the money supply usually has to grow with the growing population and the increase in productivity. Now, with respect to the disparity, the ever-growing inequality, this doesn't necessarily have to happen. It all depends if the corporations of Wall Street capture Congress, for example, which they've done. So most of the, as you know, starting after the mid-1970s, you had a lot of right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and so on being formed. And of course their mantra was lower taxes, no regulation, basically. That was their... Now, this is what I've just gone through tonight is the outcome of that, which is deliberate policy, actually. And of course the working people have been told, don't join trade unions. I mean, really, in fact, trade union membership, I think, stood at a high of about 35%. Well, now because they've persuaded not to join unions and engage in political common action, then of course now it's around about 10% and declining still. So naturally when that happens, then because corporations love to pay taxes, reduce taxes, but also lower wages and benefits to the working people, which they do and now can get away with, starting with the likes of Walmart, who then actually led the charge to go overseas. This is what happens. It's the model. Now, in other countries, because they've not quite have been so egregious in shipping manufacturing jobs overseas as much, what's called the Gini coefficient, which is the level of inequality, is not quite as high. But certainly England's gone down the same path as the USA. and in fact are sold, every day of the week because Britain is not paying its way anymore because Thatcher destroyed its manufacturing base. Almost every week you see another British company being sold off, and so it goes. And of course, as America goes on, you'll see more and more companies being sold off, and the actual land, as I said, the actual land of America is being sold off. And so these characters who stand on the steps of the Capitol with their American, flag pins in their lapels, they're the ones that have sold the country out. To a man, actually, or a woman even. Because they've gone along with all of this. And the question is, and the other thing, allowing, I've said this before, allowing Chinese to come to the country, to the top research universities and walk away with the knowledge seems to me to be utterly crazy. Because, and it goes on in England too. I go back to my college, there was no Chinese there when I was there. But I walk around and I see all these, so because it's now a for-profit university. So we so naturally, just let them, because actually the government supported universities now, just like America. I probably, if I were the same state now, because after the war my father came back injured, there was no money for me to go to college at that level. Wouldn't have happened. And of course, so it's for profit, let the Chinese come, attend the most advanced courses in technology, and in madness it's actually, but it's what happens when this rampant greed takes over, and there's no regulations for the common good. And basically, as I said, I would rename my book, Greed is Sabotaging America. And I think it is, and it has. And you can see the results. It's a disaster. So, I see people working enormous hours actually, 60, 70 hours just to make it. And in many cases, they're not making it. And because Dallas wants to make us the second Los Angeles, so more and more people come, house prices go through the roof, rents are unaffordable, no affordable houses are being built. You can, lots of mansions you can get up in the Frisco and so on. But so, and of course we're not, So, and I must say, I listened to the debates. I saw no plan that I would favor from any of them.
Question.
Sorry, I answered more fully, but then again, I do that.
Some time ago, we had a lady speaking here, and she had a list of things you could do to help the country, I believe is what it was. And one of the things she placed on there was to use a local bank rather than these big banks.
Yeah.
Can you tell me why? I don't understand.
Well, actually, no, the reason, I belong to a neighborhood bank myself, because I don't want my money leaving the community and then being spent to fund gambling speculation by the Wall Street gang.
What's the name of your bank?
It's a neighborhood bank. It's on Campbell Road. It's called the neighborhood bank. Also, I belong to the. It's a credit union. It's a credit union actually. It's a credit union. And I also still belong to the Xerox credit union, which I believe in because that money then is generally used locally for mortgages, cars, and stuff, and it goes back into that community. And really, what I wish our black friend were here. I think that the black churches actually, just like this, the priest in Spain, in the poorest part, taught a technical school, and then the Catholic Church, and in the end they formed their own bank and funded themselves, which was, and so that's now generated funds, and I reckon, I don't know why the black banks don't, it's all very well talking about the wonderful hereafter, but it would be better if they focused on the here and now, and funded some you know, banks in their own community where the money doesn't fly out of the black community but stays within it and funds businesses actually. That's what should happen. That's what I would recommend. Anyway.
John, I find it hard to talk about corruption at the top without mentioning John Corzine and then Jamie Dimon
Yep.
telling Corzine that he better come up with $1 billion or he's going to be feeding the fishes. I thought that was very interesting. What's your comment on that?
Listen, greed and corruption are everywhere. Basically, it's everywhere, and from what I've seen, it's growing actually. It's growing, and it has such a detrimental effect on the whole country. I mean, every citizen really, because violence goes up, guns, deaths go up. It really does destroy. And when you give away your technical knowledge, it's beyond belief. Anyway, next question, please.
John, haven't you also noticed that even credit unions are becoming more for the profit of the upper echelon management? Because there are fees there now that weren't there before.
No.
Interest rates are not what they could give.
Well,
blah blah blah.
Yeah, greed is everywhere.
Yeah.
The point I'm making is that, but the money usually, stays within the community actually, and doesn't shoot
no, I
off.
understand how it works.
But yes, I mean, people will pay themselves, whenever there's money flowing through their hands, a large fraction manage to stick to their fingers actually. It's,
Well, management's very pleased with
Yeah.
themselves and they reward themselves.
reward themselves, yeah, exactly.
I'm sorry.
No, it's everywhere. Yes.
It's my observation that this economy is drifting in the direction of socialism, where the government provides more and more services for a whole variety. We have housing, Medicare, and so on. And as that continues, I see the individual as having less autonomy because he's being fed. And so he keeps taking risks for nothing. And that in turn, of course, civil unrest, where you have individuals saying, give me a wallet, give me a car, or it might be whole communities. I think that's the direction we're drifting in, particularly with all these substandard wages and people living on next to nothing.
Right. Well.
And that in turn, if I may, is a precursor to a police state. Now, presently, many police organizations in this country are sending over their personnel to Israel for training.
Can you form that into a question for the speaker?
Pardon me?
Can you
Form
form that
it into a question.
into a question?
All right, well, no, I wouldn't make a statement yet, but.
This is not time for statements.
And the point is that, my contention is that all evolves in the direction of fascism.
Well, I would say that.
I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Yeah. I think we are tending towards fascism actually, because in Nazi Germany, basically, Hitler not only persuaded the German people that he could make the trains run on time, but he did so in combination with the major corporations actually. And so they were behind him actually in the 30s. And of course, yes, in a totalitarian system, actually, they did wipe out, they did recover the economy. It was a command economy, and it did recover, which of course the American economy didn't for 10 years. But German economy actually recovered by 36, 37 actually, because of the system they put in, which I could talk about if you like. But yes, when things get desperate and more people get ill-housed, ill-fed, and so on, then along comes a demagogue and said, I will fix everything. And we've seen this actually. I won't go into the politics of it, but that flavor is now there. Now, the way things are, you know, so yes, we see the 30s actually was a political dialogue between the extreme right and the extreme left. That's to say, between communism and fascism. And so people had to take sides actually. And but of course, it will always mean that a minority actually will take control, either under fascism, the right wing, or under communism, the far left wing. You see, so common sense and dialogue goes out of the window when people get desperate. Yes.
If a company or an individual adds more value to the, if its profits are less than the value it adds to the community, you have a problem with that. So if a company or a individual, through his activities, his business activities, adds more, his profits are less than the value he adds to the community, would that be a justifiable profit?
So what you're saying, he's providing a service, right, to the community that is generating profits, which, well, in fact, we see that. We see that with the financial system, which is basically parasitic. So they're generating a lot of profits, and really the value to the community is not commensurate with those profits. And so yes, it obviously does happen because it's happening. It's happened. As I said, you know, when money passes through the banker's hands, somehow a lot of coins stick to their fingers en route. It's quite magical. So, John?
Well, I look at another aspect of greed here, and I know a lot of expats used to move to Mexico because it was a much cheaper living condition down there, which raises the question of why is the living condition here in this country so expensive for the basics, for shelter, for plumbing, for electricity, water, etc. Why is the bottom line so high?
Well, I think the answer is because, you know, my view is that the basic facilities, okay, let's back up a second. Let's talk a bit about economic theory a little bit. I went over this once. It turns out that the notion that you have supply and demand where supply is rising, which means to say you're supplying more stuff at a higher price, okay, that's what it means, to meet the demand where people will pay that price. That is basically untrue, because what we've seen is that the supply curve is in fact downward sloping. That's to say, because you have the economy of scale. This is why Walmart can outcompete a mom and pop store, because they're supplying much more stuff at a lower price, so that their supply curve is downward sloping. Now, it turns out that, for example, you take the National Health Service in England, it provides pretty good health care for the whole population. Now, the cost per capita is just over half what the cost per capita in America is. And the reason is because of the economy of scale. So some things, especially in something like healthcare, where you don't have this arm's length transaction. It's not possible in healthcare, because you don't go to the doctor and say, okay, doctor, let's have a discussion about, you know, your treatment, you know, on a peer-to-peer basis. I mean, you go there and say, well, doctor, give me a pill or do. So we have to trust professionals. Now, but what I'm saying is, look, the basic commodities, if supplied by government, like water, for example, like energy, is much cheaper if a monopoly did it, because of the economy of scale. Now, you will say, well, the government is inefficient. My goodness, they have to be so that, for example, the Social Security system is fairly cost efficient for providing, you know, a basic minimum for people's old age. And by the way, they're going to need it, and they still won't get much out of it. So some things, which are natural monopolies, are best provided by the government. Now, but there's a limit to this, because big organizations are inherently inelastic in their thinking and so on. And so you must have people that can start up small businesses, which I recommend, but you must have the facilities that enable this. Okay, you must have banks that can loan to people to start businesses and so on and so forth. So yes, there's a place for monopolies, government monopolies. By the way, well regulated too. I mean, they have to be regulated, as we see with cosmetics. I mean, but anyway, so what I'm saying is that there's a case for a mixed economy where some things are cheaper done if the government does it, but not a whole estate that owns everything.
Well, since you brought it up, the government Social Security has been fudging the figures. They say figures don't lie, but liars figure. Where they are lying is the cost of living increase. What's your comment on that?
Well, government's liars, you know, as we know. So I'm not. I mean, really, what is happening is there is going to be a crisis in this country when these people that have not earned enough to put money by, and as we see, 40% of Americans definitely won't. And you know, they get their whatever it is, $1,000 a month equivalent, and you can't possibly live on that. So I mean, as I say in my book, the sight of old people bagging groceries to make a few dollars is a national disgrace. Is a national disgrace. But you know, this basically, John, this comes down to a question of fairness. Okay, I think, you know, people work. They expect to get reasonably well paid, and as productivity increases, then they should share in that. But the bargaining between employer and employees, such these days, is, you know, people, you know, get paid what they're told, and you have the gig economy, which is growing, these Uber jobs and Airbnbs and everything else. You know, it provides a very meager, very, very precarious living for lots of people. And as I said, you've got 15% of the population on minimum wage. Now, how on earth could you be living on $7, you know, and 15 cents?
Sir.
Yes. Okay.
In this whole scheme of things, what part do you see labor unions playing in terms of the economy, wages, those kind of things? I don't.
Okay. Well, okay. Sorry. Yeah,
that's good. I just wanted to know.
Okay.
Labor union.
Okay. Well, what we've seen here is that with the decline of the labor unions, the decline in the actual real wages has gone down almost with the decline of labor unions. Now, in Germany, for example, labor unions have a seat in management, actually, and so basically, labor unions ensure that the working people get a fair share of the deal, which we need, because as I said, when you depress wages and benefits, you actually slow the economy, because you're slowing the buying power. As I say, in the 30 years after the war, the trade unions were strong enough whereby the wages kept pace with the productivity. So yes, we need to also, what we've seen is wholesale shipping of manufacturing jobs overseas. Now, strong labor unions would stop that. In fact, see the actual, when you look at it, the actual logic of doing this by major corporations is to drive wages down to compare with the Chinese. Actually, that's the logic, so that they could compete in wages. Well, you know, that is a recipe for social disaster. And of course, we see this in the statistics of social strife going on. And with the country armed up to the teeth with guns, I hate to think if this goes on. I really, really do. Because there is a breaking point, actually. There is, you know, you will see people up in arms and revolting. They just won't stand for it anymore. Okay, John?
Well, I support labor unions. I believe in the principle. Yet I hear from union members that the only thing their union bosses seem to be really good at is getting their dues, and that they appear to be all bought off by the corporate heads, sometimes very publicly.
Well, you know, but the other thing, okay, the other thing is the notion that these people who walk away with tens of millions a year are really the smartest people in the room. I mean, basically, the other benefit of having employee representation. I mean, look, I work for Xerox, which is really one of the best corporations you could work for 50 years ago. You know, so everyone wrote a progress report. Well, you never write a progress report which declared any problems. So you had all this good news floating up to the top. And of course, so the guys at the top really never knew what was going on, because mostly they would never deign to come down and speak to the guys at the coalface. Okay? So they didn't know what was going on. And so if you have employer representation at the top, on the board of directors, shall we say, which is what Germany does, you can ask, look, you can say, well, why? In fact, this is the way, like John Lewis, for example, which is 100,000 department stores in England, the most respected store on the high street, by the way. The employees own it. They actually elect the board of directors, okay, and they fire them if they're not. So the point is that, look, it's the low-level people that know what's going on. They know what's going wrong. They can see it, you know. And of course, when you get this good news floating up to the top, only when a disaster happens they say, "Oh my goodness," you know. Whereas the guy on the coalface, who's out there dealing with the customers, he can know what's going wrong. You know, he can see it, and you know, the faster you fix problems. Now, like take Volkswagen, Daimler, for example. You know, their sales and their manufacturing is drastically released because some bright spark decided that, okay, we love to sell diesel, and because in Europe diesel is cheaper than gasoline to buy, but it's much more polluting. So what we're going to do, every time a car gets tested, we're going to change the software so it detects the test and then fixes the result. Well, of course, eventually they get found out. And so no one's buying diesels, and of course, so the German manufacturing is... So basically, no sane engineer would ever pass that. So that came down from the top, okay? You know, again, you know, you must have a company to be sane and keep on the right track. Must have employee representation on the board, actually. Must. Because of these problems.
Speak up.
Okay.
Okay. How do some of these CEOs get such high positions being such nitwits,
you know, that is, I've asked that question, okay. I think what happens is many of these people rise beyond their level of competence. I mean, they might be competent, you know, at accounting or competent salespeople, but running a major corporation, you know, you know, you really. But the big thing in running a corporation is to get information. Now, and I won't go with what I proposed once, but there's a way of running corporations, which I proposed, which actually has a feedback loop. So that it's the management will be self-correcting, which in today's technology would work, but again, anyway, no, if you don't have a feedback loop, you see, I'll just go into a story. We put out the 1200 printer, okay, and I was in charge of making the damn thing work. Well, we tracked everything that was going on in the field. Was it a manufacturing problem? Was it a design problem? Was it a sales problem, or financial, or what? And we tracked it, and we tracked it was a feedback loop, and so we corrected everything. And that machine generated, massive profits for Xerox actually at the time. But if you have a system that tracks problems, but it's the employees who would feed the real problems up. You see. Now, when they're feeding up nonsense and lies, which is what goes on, how on earth can you manage? And so why are these people? Because as I say, the one thing that happens is the CEO is oftentimes the chairman of the board. Well, that should never happen, okay? When the chairman of the board, theoretically, in a corporation, is meant there to be the watchdog for the owners, okay? And actually hire and fire a CEO. Now, if he's sitting on the board, well, naturally he's going to say, "Oh, I've done a great job this year. I need another few billions, whatever it is, So, and of course, oftentimes you have other CEOs sitting on the board, and naturally it's like a cozy money club. So they all pat each other's back and they all believe they're worth.
Yeah, aren't we brilliant?
Yeah, aren't we brilliant? Yeah. By the way, I've never seen any brilliance, by the way, but maybe somewhere in the deep caverns of somewhere there is brilliance. But I've never seen it myself.
Okay, go ahead. Go.
I was just wondering, have you come up with any solutions to any of the problems?
Hold closer left.
Have you come up with any solutions to these problems you've seen?
Okay. I talk about employee ownership, actually, whereby the employees, it's called industrial democracy, whereby the employees, choose which of their members sit on the board and so on. And so they own the company. Now, employees would never dream of shipping their operation overseas. Now, the other thing is, the other factor that negates progress is the fact that it's very, very difficult to sell a new technology or a new idea to a corporation because it's a risk. And so the CEO who's looking at walking away with, say, $15 million of stock options, if something happens and the project doesn't pan out, then his stock options will probably be worthless. So he doesn't want to take risks. And so the corporations are pretty, in fact, actually, after the 1200, we had the 4700 ready to go almost immediately. And that was delayed for about 4 years by Stanford because, again, it was a risk. And it was only when Kodak and IBM came out with a computer printer, they said, oh my, then they moved. But we could have moved 3 years. So because actually the cost of R&D is small compared to the tooling in manufacturing and rollout in the field. So really developing new technology is pretty inexpensive actually. But they're not, so it's very difficult to actually stand there and present new ideas actually. So, and I've done it and so on. Okay.
Well, in the area of solution, it sounds like what you're talking about is the quality process, Deming-Duran, Crosby type thing. And I can tell you from working in a corporation that this is a question.
No, no question.
I can tell you from working in a corporation that nobody in the mailroom actually has input to the CEO It's just not happening. It was all a sham for a while, so how do you deal with that?
Well, again, sometimes process really, you know, it's like, you know, everyone was thinking about a quality person or a quality company, but it was the rage, okay? Well before that, you know, as I say, to run a company properly, you have to have this feedback loop, whereby you know what's going on, people can report honestly, and, you know, because, well, the big thing is what I used to warn my troops, okay, look, we're going to run into problems, you have to tell me right away, because then we have time to fix it. If you lie to me and hide it, you're gone out the door. Because, you know, because I mean, I spent my career being handed all the technical problems, actually, which I enjoyed. Like, I always recruited teams that would, you know, it wasn't just me. I would go around the country and hire the best so we fixed problems. And we did at the time. And that's why, because I'm so outspoken and often objectionable to top management, I stayed. Because I threatened them actually many times.
Very good.
All right.
Take my seat there, everyone. Now it's your turn to talk, so whoever wants to respond to what the speaker had to say, come on up here, you have 5 minutes. Either 4 or 5.
Okay. Well, I think it's people in the country and not the CEOs and the other things, especially the politicians. But nobody asked me the question. I said, please ask me things.
I've often wondered why we have a trade imbalance. Basically, if this young man and I are countries and I keep sending him, he keeps sending me flat screen TVs and I keep sending him dollars, all he has is pictures of George Washington and he doesn't have, and I've got all these flat screen TVs. That doesn't make sense for him to keep all these dollars. It doesn't make sense but you would think he takes these dollars because he has something I want. So he sends me flat screen TVs and I send him some equivalent. He spends all those dollars back in this country. So it's just once removed from barter. He gives me a TV, I give him a bucket of wheat or something. But something's out of balance when you have this trade imbalance. It doesn't make simple sense. So I've thought about it, and I think this is the problem. The problem is our dollar, the value of our dollar is not based on our economy. The value of our dollar is based on Saudi oil. That's because we call it the petrodollar. So he sends me a flat screen TV, and what he gets is a barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia, who buys our treasury bills and then never spends them. Or so we have this, and then we have just the mechanics of international trade where they need some currency that can be used by everybody. So we have our currency has value because of Saudi oil plus just the mechanics of international trade. They need a means of exchange, so the dollar then takes value because it's just abundant and everybody has it. So there's all these reasons other than our economic reasons that people outside the world want to keep our dollars and not send them back. Now they do buy our farms and things, but still we have huge trade imbalances, which would mean that that doesn't justify it at all. So what happens when you have a currency that is overvalued? Well, the rich love it because their dollars have all this value, but we're not producing anything to get those dollars back, and the poor, there's less and less need for workers because he's getting Saudi oil and they're not working in Saudi Arabia. So it creates an environment where the labor becomes worth less and less and less in your country, even though your currency is worth more and more and more. So as I've thought about this problem, that's how I've reconciled it. We have a currency that's been overvalued for decades, and it's caused this imbalance that's resulted in a lot of people not having good paying jobs. Thanks.
I'll be back.
Could you tell the lady, I like it on the green.
What do you want to be or?
Correct.
I think one of the main things that we are missing is we're missing consequences. It's kind of the story, are all men created equal? And we can kind of go around there. I mean, in the eyes of the law in this country, we're all purportedly created equal. But you find at the upper echelons, the financial echelons, the kind of consequences that someone at a lower level would experience for their actions, they are not experiencing up there. And the example I gave earlier was John Corzine, who should have gone to jail for betting 40-1 other people's money and losing it, and yet he didn't go to jail. And yet we have people all the time going to jail for much lesser financial crimes. You have people going to jail for writing a hot check. So, writing a hot check for like $3 billion and then you don't go to jail. So we don't have an equality of consequences, I think, is one of the issues here. Actually, I was very surprised by the speaker's non-confrontational presentation here and kind of the political evenness, because actually NAFTA and GATT were bipartisan. We had both Bill Clinton and Bob Dole going in there and approving GATT and signing off on this. Now, how did we get into such a bad deal for this country? We were sold that deal by the likes of Alvin and Heidi Toppler, writing their books. I forget all the names of their books. I remember I had one other book called Power Shift. We were instructed, we were led to believe that we could become a service economy. And we didn't need manufacturing anymore. We didn't need to produce our own goods. You would just kind of come in and wave a feather over the end product, and somehow or other that would be our economy, and we'd be on top of the world. And it was a lie. I've never heard anybody really propose consequences for the Topplers. And I think also one of the things I point out is a lot of this has come from a promotion of the idea of the abolition of national borders and the idea of like a North American zone, which would include Canada and Mexico. And there's a basic fundamental unreality to that. Maybe you could do Canada and the United States. How are you going to meld in Mexico with its economy the way it is? In other words, an interview I did back in 97, 98, the interviewee was kind of an insider on things, and he said, well, they're planning on bringing America down from first world status to second world status, and that we're going to be kind of blended in with other countries. My question was, how do you stop at second world status? How do you keep them sliding all the way down to third world? And when you're competing against slave labor in China, Mexico, India, basically, that's where things are headed. They're definitely headed south. And the unreality of those proposals and that plan, I think, we've been living with the consequences of this, and yet no one has really been brought to task for that. So I think, anyway, I was very encouraged by the speaker's presentation.
Oh, wow, thank you.
John, I enjoyed your presentation. I'm sorry I missed a great deal of it, but you guys are dry up here. We had the heaviest rain I've ever seen.
Oh, really?
Really?
Yeah, we couldn't hardly see anywhere in front of us.
I came through part of it on my way through.
And so that's why I was late. I didn't want to miss part of it. I know we have problems everywhere, but sometimes you get bogged down in problems and you don't have the flexibility or the resilience to try to find practical solutions. There are a couple of things I want to talk about. You talk about credit unions and local banks. They spend their money in the community, and I've heard this argument a great deal. In African American communities, everything flows out, and nothing flows in. And I made a point some time ago that's happening now to the United States. And what do we do about it is the real thing. Everything, whether we like it or not, is kind of globalized. And everything, the big banks set the parameters for everything, and the small banks have to work within that process. Otherwise, they can't do what they would like to do because they don't have the resources to work it. So I think there's a place for localism, and we should encourage it. But if a local bank get too much business, the bigger banks will come up with ways to buy them out or do something. So that's what happens to that. So I think we got to understand, how do we compete successfully in a global economy? I think we got to focus on that. And I mean, the corporate greed, everything, you were right on T. Because greed will make you do things ordinarily you wouldn't do. And that's what's happened to corporations. They forget about, they don't even know how. A good example, when George H.W. Bush ran against Clinton in '92, he didn't know anything about chocolate for his family. They always had people to do it. And Clinton knew, he knew how to do it. That's a big difference we see. The higher up you get, the more you move from reality. And so that's something we need to look at. When you have a company, we talk about fascism, we already have that in the United States. It's controlled by the corporate communities. The multinationals really control what happens in all the world. And when that happens, it's out of the hands of the small people. Our Constitution gives us the leverage if we would exercise political freedom and not be so misinformed by what you get on the media about candidates. It's not worth nothing. You've got to know something about the people, what they did before they ran for office, to predict what they'll do if they get elected. And most of them don't know that. And we really, someone's telling me civics is elected. Now it's not required. It used to be required to take civics. They ought to be required to take civics and economics. Maybe they'd be able to understand some of the problems we deal with. Because that old perception of supply and demand, people control supply and they control demand. One of the books I read is the mutual funds. They control almost $9 trillion, almost all the things in endowment funds, in retirement funds, and they can cause the department any way they want to. And the part you said, we have CEOs, and not only the CEO of the company, but also the chairman of the board, and that's definitely a conflict of interest. That shouldn't be, but that is. So those are the things we kind of work on to deal with the corporate community. We got to find a way to work with them that's going to be benefit to all of us. The thing about how do we make capitalism work for everyone is a difficult thing unless people are fairly astute, both political and economical, can vote not what they think is best for them individually, but what's best for all of us. And when we start thinking that way, I think the end results will be different. We'd elect people who would do what we want them to do rather than be bought out by Congress. You look at the number of people, how many are millionaires is in Congress? They didn't go there millionaires, they became millionaires after that. We had a governor, Governor Rick Perry. Most of his life was in government. Great deal, getting $7,200 a year, been in the state legislature. And lieutenant governor before he became governor. He was land commissioner, I believe, for 4 years. He made $100,000 those 4 years. And he was governor the longest time, $150,000 a year. But you don't hardly get rich like he is with $150,000 a year. So those are some of the things we have to look at. And as long as we are polarized and divided the way we are, things are gonna get worse. That's how I see it.
One of the things that always seems to come up in discussions like this is minimum wage. You know, it's presented as, well, people need to have a living wage that they can live on and stuff like that. But what seems to be forgotten is there's two sides to that equation. And what is usually presented is that, well, we need to have a minimum wage so people can have a living wage and pay for their expenses and stuff like that. But what seems to be lost is where that money comes from. Now, if you're running a business and you have $5,000 available to buy a car that you need to move your goods around, are you going to buy a $30,000 car? Well, you don't have the money for that. So you can't. You have to buy something within your budget. PragerU has a really powerful 5-minute video on the minimum wage, and what they describe is a pizza parlor, a successful pizza parlor, operating in Seattle, paying their employees, I think, minimum wage or somewhat above that, somewhere on the order of $7, $8, or $9 an hour, whatever it is. I'm sure there were some that were making more, and it was successful. They were doing pretty good. The owner of the business was making a profit, and it was a worthwhile profit. And if you go to business school, you learn the term normal profit. In other words, if you run a business, you've got to make a normal profit, a reasonable profit that makes it worth your effort to run your business. If you put all of your effort into the business and you make no money other than enough to pay your expenses, it's not worth it. You're not going to keep doing it. So this pizza parlor was reasonably successful, doing well, and then Seattle passed a law that said everybody has to pay a minimum wage of $15 an hour. So what this pizza parlor had to do was virtually double the wages of all of their employees, and if you run a business, labor expense is most of your expenses, something like 70 or 80%, maybe more. Well, if 80% of your expenses immediately double, they figured out they would be able to continue functioning, but they wouldn't be able to make any profit. It wouldn't be worth it. So that pizza parlor went out of business by choice. They had plenty of business, they had people coming in, but they couldn't pay their employees $15 an hour and make a profit. So they decided it's not worth it, so we're just going to shut down. So the employees went from making $8 or $10 an hour to suddenly making $15 an hour to suddenly making nothing. So this is how minimum wage thinking works. When politicians decide that businesses need to do A, B, or C, you know, their brains are somewhere they don't belong, and they decide that, well, you have to do all this stuff because we think it's a good thing, but they don't understand how business operates. Okay, so what they do is they impose on business a minimum wage, which makes it unprofitable for the business to operate, so the business shuts down, and all of those people who were making the money that they were willing to accept to operate on, they could go find a different job if they wanted, but they chose to work there. Now all of a sudden those people are out of a job, and that business is not operating anymore. And this is why socialism is such a bad idea, because when you have a free market, you have individual people making their own decisions, deciding who they're going to interact with and who they're going to buy from or sell to. Those are individual transactions that individual people decide to make on their own. When you have socialism, you have a government which is composed of people with certain ideas who impose those ideas on other people and say that this is the way you're going to do it because we think this is a good idea, and if you don't like it, we're going to throw you in jail. And that is the absolute perfect way to destroy a country. I mean, witness Venezuela, you know, every other socialist experiment, and the Scandinavian countries are not socialist. They will tell you that themselves.
Can I ask a question?
No.
Is that no?
No, but you can get up and speak.
Yeah, you can get up and speak.
You can get up and speak.
No, it's a question for you.
No.
But anyway, so you know, all of this stuff about imposing all of these ideas on business is just the screwiest, stupidest idea there is. It's never worked, and it never will.
Give him hell, Lorraine.
I don't know what name you give to a level of equality across a population, okay? Whatever Norway and Sweden calls it, I'll have some of that, okay?
Free market.
Because there are free markets obviously operating there, okay? 40 years and 3 times the American taxpayer has been screwed royally and fed the pablum of give the money to the corporations in the major tax cuts and they will let it all trickle down and create the jobs, which I don't know how you'd even begin to go pay scale on that kind of thing given your philosophy, Ken, but we've been screwed. I also worked for Xerox Corporation, okay, and wore many hats there, okay, along with John in the day. And corporations prior to the 80s cared about their people. They not only paid them a very decent wage, but they also gave benefits and sent them out little booklets every year to say, this is where you're going to be when you retire, because they expected you to be there for the next 30, 40 years. It was called the golden handcuffs for a reason, okay? And to that end, they expected you to deliver loyalty to them because they were going to be loyal to you. If you don't have a manufacturing base, I don't care where you're located, you don't have an economy that's ever going to work long term for you. Because with all those blue collar workers come all the white collar jobs that do the R&D, do product development, so on and so forth. That's all gonzo from this country at this point in time, okay? Back in the day, you looked at a pie chart. Manufacturing was the biggest sector in that pie chart. Banking and insurance were little slivers to the piece, and then you had government and other services. You look at a pie chart today, the financial sector has taken over not only what manufacturing used to have, but they've also chunked into the piece that government used to take a care with. Without regulations, okay, we are going to continue to get screwed by the greed that John spoke to tonight, okay? In order to protect not only a worker's voice, you have to have a trade union of some sort, people that actually sit on the boards and what have you, to protect workers' rights. We have no consumer rights whatsoever today, and therefore we are importing junk, and it's dangerous junk too. Even the clothing that we wear, the stuff that they expect you to change out every year, and so you think you're getting a deal, but you're really not getting a deal because half of them are full of petroleum products. I mean, I haven't seen wool gabardine in I don't know how long. Okay, the quality, the cotton, and everything else, silk, that used to be manufactured, it's all gone to hell. A paper towel, it's like you can smell the, I don't know what they're putting in it, but you know, Kleenex tissue actually has an odor to it, to me, anyhow. So all of that, however we get back there, it's not going to ever go back to how we enjoyed it, okay? Because these corporations have fed on this greed now for decades, okay? You can't even access the corporate headquarters anymore. Everything's an 800 number. And back in the day, when we worked for a corporation, if a customer ever called Xerox headquarters with a problem, they always got through to the executive level. That phone rang at the local Xerox office saying, what the hell's going on? Get this resolved now. And everyone moved tutti sweet. Okay, so the regulations, one, have to be there, and that also takes a proper sized government. I mean, because as far as I'm concerned, you know, yes, we've got some corrupt people in our government, more than there should ever have been there in the first place, okay? Going into public service used to be an absolute direction because you wanted to give of yourself to the country that you loved, okay? You weren't placed there to make $1 million or to have a revolving door or what have you, but you were going to get a good pension at the end of the day, okay, for that public service. That somehow needs to get restored, and it won't ever unless we do make people accountable for their ills, okay, on behalf of screwing the American public. The privatization of government, services that were provided before. The penal system is the most egregious of them all. Okay, privatizing the prison system, which violates people's rights, because somehow you have a contract with the government. All of a sudden, the government has no right of proper oversight to you. So you can do whatever the hell you want to a prisoner under a private prison system versus, you know, the other. The ACLU has done a remarkable report on this, and you should read it. The most current case of privatization, okay, it's the housing of these children in Homeland, Florida. These people, I believe, are getting, the number I'd heard some time ago was that most of these private entities that are housing detainees, children, imprisoning these children, are getting approximately $750 a day per head. Okay, this is not, no, I heard that some months ago. Okay, and then you've got people in the Wayfair, is it? Wayfair employees actually went on strike outside their own building this week because these private companies had a deal with Wayfair, I guess, to finally ship all these beds because it wasn't a good photo op to have kids in cages with little aluminium blankets on them or what have you. Okay, so these employees were so outraged with the treatment of these kids that they actually went outside. Now, Wayfair will still continue to send these beds or furniture or what have you to these private companies that are imprisoning and treating these kids in an abominable fashion, okay? And because, hey, Wayfair's jumped on the gravy train. Why not? I mean, all of a sudden you have, you know, in some government entities, there tends to be like 4 or 5 little cottage industries that jump out and jump on that same, you know, gravy train. So, you know, all I can say is that monopolies are an absolute happening right now, have been for some time. There's no antitrust laws, and all I can tell you is that the way it is right now, the corporate philosophy of most of these monopolies is when you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. So beware.
That's a good one.
Just like they haven't been enforcing,
Thank you, John, for your presentation tonight. You had good facts. You include facts every time you speak. I can tell you've done more research. Your first comment, greed ruins everything.
Can you move the mics a bit so you're speaking into it? Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah.
As you said it, I thought, when I saw the topic, I thought, do I want to hear John speak about greed again? And then I thought, yes, I've been interested in poverty lately, so I need to hear this. And as he said that tonight, what came to my mind, first of all, was the story about the Midas touch, a child's story. And the king had the, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of the Midas touch. The king was granted this request that everything he touched be turned to gold. And of course that was fine and dandy. He had all these wonderful gold things until it came to his beloved daughter, who also turned to gold. And I guess the moral is greed can take away the very thing you love and want. First, an observation. How many of you have built a new house in the past 2 or 3 years? Built a new house.
Built one, not moved into one.
Built a new house. Okay. 2 or 3 years ago, I go to this dentist and doctor over in Prestonwood. It's Preston Royal area. And so I usually go to Crest and then cut up Orchid because there are such beautiful homes along there and their gardening is fabulous. I love to look at their flowers. And then I noticed more houses. They had these long, the long houses they used to build, just flat and long. Well, all of that street was like that. But then suddenly they started tearing down houses. And now, in the first block, out of 16 houses, only 4 remain in that condition. Every single one of them has been razed to the ground, and they have these 2-story, what the kids at school refer to as mansions, and they are mansions. This is Orchid Street, if you choose to drive down that street. They're beautiful homes. This is who got the tax cuts. These people got the tax cuts. How many of you, I hear on TV that the stocks are doing well, the stock exchange is doing well. How many of you have stocks? 2 or 3 or 4 of us. Okay. That's not what the masses have. The masses don't have stocks, so that's not, what do you say? That doesn't tell what's going on in the economy. They tell us that, I heard someone recently say that they have decided that the biggest crime of the 20th century is involving greed, swindling, high price money. This has been determined to be the biggest crime of the 20th century. And in a movie I saw recently, one of the characters said, this was a European, said, the ruination of America will be that they value money over people. So in a sense tonight, we could say, John's talk was about money, but is it really? Isn't it about people? What's happening to people, the humanity of people. And for those of us who still have trouble
seeing what is happening to people, we might ask ourselves, where is our humanity? These are people that this is affecting. These children that were there, I don't call it a detention center, I call it a concentration camp, because they were punished. Not all, they were given next to nothing. Some were dehydrated, no bath, no soap, no toothpaste for 3 weeks. Little children, babies, 4-month-old babies taken from their mothers, sleeping on the floor. I get lost when I start thinking about that. They're babies. And they were describing one room where there were 20 or 30 young girls in one room. And of course, lice came about. And so they were given 2 combs and they were told to comb each other's hair to get the lice out. This was on public radio. There's an excellent program on there. And you're not supposed to share combs if you have lice because it spreads it. And the girls lost one of the combs, so the one piece of bedding, the sheet that they had, was taken away from them as punishment for losing the comb. They refused donations from the public. That told me right there, this is planned. This isn't because they don't have the money for these children. This is planned. When you refuse help from the public, every place I know takes donations, but when you have babies there and you refuse help, this is planned. This is pure and simple politics. I hope many of you called your congressperson that day. I did, and I told them that I thought it was concentration camp. You're punishing these people. You're punishing children. You're using them as pawns. Let me see, what else? Homelessness, they tell us homelessness is up in America. Yes, we can say employment is at a good low, all-time low, but is it a living wage? How many people are working 3 jobs? I ran into a former student recently, and he was working as a custodian at DISD, but he was also working as, he was working at McDonald's on the weekend, and I ran into him later, and he was in Dollar Tree. He goes into Dollar Tree when he can, and he's still having trouble paying his rent. He has 3 jobs. So it's not a living wage. I don't know if I read this correctly or not, but I thought I read recently that Walmart has decided they are now paying $14 and $15 an hour to their employees, which is good. And I might suggest to you Ken's story about the pizza company. I doubt if every pizza company in town did that. I can't see a place with no pizza. They did, but that was their choice. Maybe, perhaps they did that because we as people don't like change. And to have to go through what it takes to go through to make adjustments is difficult. But that's a fact of life. We have to make adjustments our whole life. And politicians wanting big money, I don't think the big money, they have, they're in people's pockets, but they're not the big money. The big money is the corporations. And recently I became aware of a group, and I started going to some of their meetings. It's called American Promise, and it's a nationwide, nonpartisan movement for the passing of a 28th Amendment to address big money in politics. They want to get it to a decent level, not, as Tom always says, we have the best Congress money can buy. And they would like to address that in some capacity. And this group is wanting feedback from people as well. They're giving information and they're wanting feedback as well. So I would like to invite you to check out their website, americanpromise.net.
I think, AmericanPromise.net. But once again, thank you, John, for your presentation.
Well, I just want to follow. That was really good, Jim. No, about, okay.
Did you get that clear from Tom?
Speaking of migrants, okay, last Tuesday I brought over, new items, what was it, suntan lotion, bug spray to the Oaklawn Methodist Church. But what happened, they stopped collecting things for, you know, the facilities on the border. But the Funky East Dallas is having a meeting, well, it's a party at Winfrey Point, and one of the ladies there, her name's Terry, this is going to be on July 3rd, is going down to, with her friends, to one of the respite areas, okay? So when the migrants get off the bus, they're going to be there and hand out items. I was able to get 300 toothbrushes, but we need little toothpaste. I bought razor blades and anything you can think of that, you know, people would need. I brought over a suitcase for their travels, but it's going to be at Winfrey Point at 6:30 at the, Julie might be interested, the Funky East Dallas, I think that's what they're called.
Funky East Dallas.
Funky East Dallas Democrats. And if you're interested, you can call me, I'll give you my number right now, and I'd be glad, you could come by my house and drop off things. I'm gonna bring it over there, when is that, Wednesday night? It's July 3rd, right. But my neighbor is a dentist at Viva Dental, and she gave me 300 toothbrushes, so I thought that was just great. Yes?
What size toothpaste do you?
I'm thinking about little travel toothpaste. You know, that you have the little ones, or small.
Dental offices.
Oh, I didn't get toothpaste, I got
No, I'm
toothbrush.
just wondering, because sometimes they get samples.
Yeah, right.
To make some cool.
Oh, that'd be great, you could just call me.
I didn't know if you were looking for
And
like
she's
a
gonna
full
drive down to buy, I guess, what is one of the big facilities, you know, when they get off the bus. Apparently she knows exactly what to do. And she said, I'll be going there, just bring things to me, so I have my car loaded already. Okay, thank you.
You know, Trump gets disparaged for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and a lot of things like that, but I just found on USA Today, which is not a conservative publication, a list of businesses where they say there's more than 125 U.S. employers, big and small, including large corporations, those nasty, greedy corporations, who gave $1,000 bonuses to their employees when that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed. AT&T gave 200,000 employees $1,000 bonuses. Alaska Airlines gave $1,000 bonuses to 19,000 employees. American Airlines gave $1,000 bonuses to 200,000? To 130,000 employees. Bank of America gave $1,000 bonuses to 145,000 employees. Comcast gave $1,000 bonuses to 100,000 employees. There's a whole list. And there was no law that said you must give a $1,000 bonus to anybody. It was simply a result of cutting the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, which all of a sudden put a lot of money in those corporations' pockets, and lo and behold, they gave it to their employees.
2%.
Go for it.
Human nature is always operating.
My wife is very liberal. I live in a liberal white neighborhood. My wife is very liberal and I'm very conservative. So my wife and I have been arguing about the immigrants, and she just You know, basically, my wife's ready to let anybody into the country. I try to get some limits, who can't come in. They virtually don't exist. She wants to take anybody in who can get here. And I even asked her, well, what about the people who can't get here? Should we send them airfare? Because they obviously need it. So I said to her, okay, you want to do this, let's bring a family into the house. No, I would get you, that, I would say that she changed her mind. She didn't bring any into the house. She said, well, there's a charity taking care of that. And I would bet you, in my entire liberal white neighborhood, not one family has taken any of these people into their houses. So, I mean, it's easy to say it, but if you really want to take on some of the burden, take them into your house. Now, where do they go? They're going to be living next to some poor guy with 3 daughters, and there's going to be 7 of them in the house next door. I'm not saying they're not people, but they end up living next to somebody who's very concerned about having these illegal people in their house, and they're concerned for their daughters. They don't live next to you. They live in poor neighborhoods, and they make somebody else's life difficult. I appreciate your goodwill. I do. I do. I appreciate my wife's goodwill. But at some point, you got to say, I'm not Mother Teresa, and these people need to stay in their countries, and they need to fight to make their countries better.
Amen.
I mean, I think it's just a matter of practicality, and I appreciate all your good hearts. But at some point, you know, you got to say no.
You have to make it work.
Well, I would start, John. I don't know if I professed my absolute appreciation of your talk earlier, but I just wanted to make sure.
You're right.
I do. Okay, just want to check that in before I said anything else. Okay. Who says that only liberals are somehow humanitarians? Okay? We cannot take every refugee in the world. We already know that at the outset. Okay? However, the situations that are occurring in these Central American countries are as a result of American imperialist, whatever, interference in their governments a long, long bloody time ago, okay? We helped set up a lot of these dictators to begin with. We have millions upon millions of refugees flooding into Europe as a result of our Iraq war, which fed the military complex. Money in war, very, very good for the economy of a few, okay? So, yeah, we got a problem right now, which has been exacerbated by a president which doesn't know one end of his body from another. I could use other terminology, okay, as it relates to negotiating anything. He couldn't negotiate his way out of a paper bag, as far as I'm concerned. He's caused more issues with this, and I think it's also very interesting that during the last election, 2018, when things were going bad for Cruz, okay, all of a sudden, 2 weeks before the election, you had these little caravans coming up. And that turned the tide, and then all of a sudden, after the elections, where were the caravans? They were gone, okay? I mean, so I'm not necessarily saying that might have been a political move, but it's hard for it to leave my gray matter, okay?
It's a fair conspiracy theory.
Well, yeah. You don't think there are some? Seriously?
I'm agreeing with you.
It's just, they were there and then all of a sudden they weren't. Okay, I found that very, very, and they were very, very organized. They even provided little yellow jackets, you know, for the people that were, you know, doing the Pied Piper number with them, and so on and so forth. So the point is that this policy that's going on right now, let's just speak to what's going on with these kids. Okay? Adults know the risks. Okay? If they're, even though the population, the demographics changing that's coming over the border, they understand they may be detained. Okay? But we're not talking about a bunch of adult men that are caged here. We're talking about children and the incompetence of an administration that actually separated these kids, even in the earlier days. And then they took their parents and deported them back out without even saying, oh, by the way, did you come in with a kiddo? Now, where did we put that kid? I mean, where is that kid? Well, we'll catch up. We'll send you a letter when we find him or her. I mean, this is just absolutely hideous. And it was done to be mean. The words came out of the Attorney General's mouth. Okay? And now for this idiot that sits there this week and mocks, you know, oh, please don't interfere with our elections to Putin, as if it's some, you know, subject for amusement between these two creeps, okay? It's outrageous. And the American people sit by. I'm sorry. These are not conspiracies. We have heard with our ears, we have seen with our eyes, okay, and read accordingly as well. Not only saw him in public or read his tweets or what have you. And it's like, it's everybody else's fault, but not his. Give me a bloody break. We have never had this kind of horror show going on. And Americans are warm and they're generous and they're giving people. Okay? And this is an absolute stain on our reputation. Period. Okay? And by the way, hourly wage in Australia, $24 an hour. Okay? If you're under 18, sorry, you're only going to get $17 an hour. All right? And they have health insurance over there. Okay, national health insurance. And we have a friend that has cancer. Okay, and he has to, he lives down the coast, but you have to get to Sydney for his treatment, his chemo and his radiation. The government pays for him to fly from where he lives to Sydney, pays him her per diem to eat, and will put him up in a hotel. He stays with family. So I mean, this horrible thing about, oh, these liberal ideas and this socialism, enough. Let's be fair to everybody and let's let them breathe and be able to eat and have a roof over their head and get an education. Thank you.
Maybe you should run for president.
I'll speak to Donald. Maybe he can find
I don't like saying hey man when you got done.
Okay, let me see if I can, let me see if I can kind of clear the passion away from the microphone here and get it back to a little bit more copacetic. I didn't hear talk about bean counters. I wanted to bring up bean counters. And people tell me who examined both of the major shuttle accidents that in fact those were bean counter decisions that were made. They knew they shouldn't launch with the Challenger. They knew they had an icing condition. Then with the other, what's the other one that bought it? Does anyone remember the name of it?
The O-ring. Is it
The O-ring was the Challenger.
Yeah.
There was the O-ring failure. They knew they had a problem, and the bean counter said, go ahead and launch. And then the other craft, the other shuttle that had a...
Was it Columbia that came
Columbia,
out of Texas?
yeah, Columbia that ended up all over Texas. They had a problem with a damaged heat shield panel, and the bean counters, they wanted to, what they wanted to do is they wanted to rotate the shuttle over to where they could get a good view and see how bad the damage was, where the damage was, find out, and they actually had the means of repair. They could have done kind of a spacewalk to go out and do some repair on that. And the bean counters decided that they were over budget anyway, and they shouldn't do that. And so we have instances where I would say greed, or the maximizing of profit by different institutions, has been absolutely deadly. And one of the things I find most disgusting, and this is maybe my little deal, it's the shopping carts. Is there a shopping cart in the entire Metroplex that will actually roll straight? You go, and I mean, it's you know, the pick of the bad, because you know, you don't know whether one's going to roll, as you're going to be going down the aisle, thump, 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 thump. Now, we can manufacture jet engines that operate for thousands of hours, but we can't manufacture a shopping cart wheel that doesn't go to crap in you know, the shortest of time. And this is an example of planned obsolescence. And to me, this is kind of a philosophical fouling of our nest here. Is we gave up on the stars. And I mean, I remember back in 1970, we were going to the stars, we were doing, I mean, there was no limit to where we might go technologically as a society. I checked out for about 14 years. I come back and everybody is narcissistically involved with their stock portfolio and wondering how the stocks are going to do that day. I mean, it's all financial. No products being produced. No great vision for a future. I mean, we could have one somebody was saying, you know, what was it, 1979, some president or something, declared a war on cancer. I would say we've lost the war on cancer, folks. We've had no major advances, and everybody's going through the same torture. It's deplorable, but we really do need some kind of a new frontier. We need a new challenge that doesn't involve wartime, that isn't about killing our enemies, that gives us a vision to go forward and be a productive society again. We need a new frontier.
Well, go on up there. We're running out of time though.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you objected to the way those children were treated? How many of you objected to the way the children were treated? Okay. My point was, and I perhaps didn't make it, I gave too many details and didn't make my point clear enough. Like the guy said, we have to start thinking in terms of people instead of money. If the president can say, I can find $1 billion here and $1 billion there for the wall, they ought to be able to give those kids something to sleep with and something to eat and wash themselves with. That's the thing. We're thinking in terms of money and not thinking in terms of people. And I think some of you heard me say some things that I thought I said some things that I did not say. The organization is about keeping money, big money, out of politics and the huge donations. So a person without means cannot run for president. You have to have big money to run for president. This is what I'm talking about. Making it where the people have more of a say rather than big corporations. And true, the big corporations do some good things. I'll give you that, they do. But they also run the show. And we're trying to make it to where the people have more say instead of the corporations.
Quick follow.
Yeah. I guess I'm the last one standing. I want to thank our speaker for doing a great job here tonight. You got us all thinking, and it was a magnificent speech that you gave. I've got to tell you that.
Thank you, Tom.
It was, because you brought up all the different points that we have to address and we have to look at. The purpose of regulation was never to put the government on the backs of people, but to harness the forces of profit and greed and make it work for society instead of against it. With deregulation, we have the free enterprise of burglars. That's what we're getting into now. And that's the big mistake of this generation. This is the big mistake we're making in our Congress. It was brought up by somebody here earlier tonight that I brought up earlier, that we have the best Congress money can buy. And we do. And that's one of our problems. We have corporations controlling the Congress. And we have congressmen that get reelected. In fact, as far as incumbents being beat by a challenger, it's almost unheard of. It hasn't happened in this century to speak of. In my view, one of the issues that could be done would be to get free elections. The last 90 days of a general election would be free airtime. Congress would vote for that. Why? Because they get to keep the money they raise, and there's no history of a challenger beating an incumbent in this century. They'll vote for it. And once they put it in effect, then some challengers will defeat some incumbents. They'll get free airtime too. And when that happens, they'll represent the people who do the electing instead of representing the people buying their vote in Washington. Then you can put tariffs on corporations that leave town and go overseas on you, because that's what we need to do. Apple produces everything in China. They don't produce anything here. So we're buying everything that they produce. And they're being produced with cheaper labor. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Where are the jobs going? And earlier was brought up about labor unions. Labor unions, even the members of labor unions in many cases, don't respect their own people because they can't get anything done. Why can't they get anything done? Because corporations, if you ask for more wages, they pack up and leave. That's what's going on. And why do they leave? Because they can. They go to another country where labor costs are cheaper. I was in Mexico 20 years ago in Chihuahua talking to one of the managers of a General Motors Corporation, and he was raving about his employees that only work for $5 an hour. He says in Detroit they're working for $25 an hour. He said, we're going to run them out of business. That was what he told me 20 years ago. And that's what's happened, and that's what's going on. And we have antitrust laws that are not being enforced. We have antitrust laws that originally were within this country, not to go outside this country. And we need to put tariffs on corporations that go overseas. This is where they're missing the boat now. They're trying to put tariffs on everything. It's ridiculous. And just put it on an American corporation that leave town. Look at Lordstown, Pennsylvania. Or Lordstown, Ohio, excuse me. They shut down the General Motors. Where did they move? They went to Mexico, where labor costs are cheaper. They'll produce the cars there, and they'll sell them back here. And they lost all the jobs, everything else. And labor unions can't do anything when a corporation's going to pack up and leave on you. You can't get a wage increase. And why have the wages not kept up in this country? Why have your labor unions not suffered so badly? That's part of it. Corporations leaving town and going overseas where labor costs are cheaper. This is hurting society. In some senses, we might say we have met the enemy, and it is us. Our nation's $22 trillion in debt and growing. Why is this? Some U.S. corporations become multinational corporations that physically left our country and left our populace with nothing to go where labor and environmental costs are far cheaper. We lose the jobs of production. We eventually lose research and development as it follows production. We pay more for the products and transportation costs, etc., from these relocated corporations. Taxes to our government are far diminished. The investor class gains, and everyone else suffers. Carried to its logical end, progressive countries suffer, non-progressive countries are exploited, nationalistic rebellions ensue, such as Brexit in progressive countries that are now being exploited, and everyone else suffers as we wander around swatting at snowflakes in search of solutions. Well, the solutions are right in front of us. This is what we have to do. We got to get involved in our elections. We got to change things. We got to cut corporations so they're not so they don't leave town. and by putting tariffs on those corporations, they can produce here rather than leave town and go produce where labor costs are cheaper. The tariff will keep them from leaving the town. Anyway, I better shut up while I'm ahead, and I'll give this back to our speaker, John, and thank you very much.
Well, I began the talk by saying that the socio-economic indicators were on the downturn, okay? And the country, and this was obvious from the numbers. Now, the main fact of that is this low-wage economy. Now, it is mindless to say lower wages are such a good thing. If there was such a good thing, why don't we lower wages? Yeah, all right? Now, when you have low wages, okay, the incentive is not there just to hire more lower wage people, where the answer really is to have higher productivity. Okay? For example, in Europe, your credit card always has a chip and a pin. Okay? Now, in this country, you don't have a pin normally with a credit card because it costs money to implement. Okay? So therefore, you know, the fraud goes on. Now, it's the same thing. Once, if you have higher wages, it forces you to innovate and to have more productivity in the economy. But what's happened here for the last 40 years, every ounce of increase in productivity has not gone to the working people as it should have. It's gone to the 1% and the 0.1% who do not spend it, you know, on productive investments. They spend it on, you know, increased assets, like they buy gold, they invest in shares, they buy more mansions and stuff like that. This is whereas also, you know, I think he may have left. Anyway, he asked, you know, why is this imbalance? Well, you know, this imbalance has to be paid for. Okay, so as I explained, it's paid for by selling assets. So you're selling your country off, but more than that, you're losing control of it actually. And England has done that on a much higher scale. So England no longer owns one car manufacturing business anymore. Whole areas of London have been sold off. And every day a week another business has been sold off. So in the end, you're selling off your country for this so-called benefit, you know, of all this free trade nonsense. And what I have to say is the notion that you can, you know, lower wages to survive, which is what the corporation would like, you know. What are you going to do? Lower them down to the wages paid in Mexico? Lower them down to the wages paid in China? So we can compete? No. No, the fact of the matter is this country needs, it's people of this country that create the wealth by working. You must fund infrastructure, you must fund especially education, which is so costly in this country. Many poor people are just turned off, give up going to college, okay? And we need the poorest to go to college, because it's the poorest that try hardest. The rich kids on trust funds, why would you go to beat your brains out, you know, learning advanced Fourier analysis? Why would you? And of course they don't. So we invest in the wrong things, and you know, the whole economy, you know, is fallacious actually. So, you know, all I can say is, and I explain this in my book, that Adam Smith is total nonsense, the theories of free trade are total nonsense, and the stuff about supply demand as taught in SMU and the wonders of David Ricardo are still taught, you know, and it's totally fallacious. Doesn't work. This country has a growing number of oligopolies. So I mean, it's just not. It's not the economy that's portrayed to. And, you know, and driving more and more people to work more and more hours and more jobs just to survive is suicide for the country, actually. Because the social consequences, you know, will not be endured, actually. And it will get to that point where there will be riots. And we've seen it before. Anyway, that's my talk tonight. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to do it again and bore you some more.
Who knows? Maybe we'll all be rich.
Well, that's it for tonight. Our speaker is still here. They kick us out of here at 10:30, just so you know. And thank you very much. See, well, remember, next 2 weeks there are no meetings, so we don't have a. What date is our next meeting?
27th?